Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Neil Chase. I'm the CEO of CalMatters. I'm guessing you know us because you're here. If you don't know CalMatters, we're a nonprofit news organization covering policy and politics all over California. We do stuff on the web, we do stuff on the radio, we do stuff on TV, we have a daily newsletter we'll make sure you're signed up for, whether you want to or not. But there's nothing more fun and more impactful than doing these things in person, having a real conversation with people in the room who can think and react and ask questions and answer questions. And we love doing stuff in person as much as we can. So we're super grateful to you for being here and to this wonderful space for hosting us. What an amazing place if you haven't seen it before. We are going to get into the panel here because that's the meat of what we want to do. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator. Marisa Kendall is an experienced journalist who, in her last job, was working at the San Jose Mercury News and the East Bay Times when they won a Pulitzer Prize, and has been with us for a couple of years now. And when she was at the Mercury News and the East Bay Times, I was there with her, we pivoted a lot of our coverage to just say, you know what, the only thing anybody cares about in our community is housing. It's the only thing we talk about, housing, homelessness, related issues. And so let's stop pretending it's something for one or two people to cover, and let's move a whole part of the newsroom to really think, much more aggressively about covering it and engage with what the community cares about. And of course, that hasn't changed. That's even more acute today. So I'm really happy that we can have a conversation today around the issues that are so crucial to so many people. I want to thank the folks who made this possible. Our sponsors, the California Community Foundation, has been great. The Center for Nonprofit Management, Efrain Escobedo is here, who is also a member of the board of CalMatters. That makes him my boss, so feel free to tell him what a great event this was. And Southern California Grantmakers. I think some of our friends from SCG are here as well. So very happy they were able to make this possible. We're going to be doing a series of events with our partners around Southern California over the next few months. And with that, I will turn things over to Marisa. We'll talk for a little bit, and then we'll do some Q&A.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Neil. So I will introduce our lovely panelists, and thank you all for taking your lunchtime to be here with us today. Starting on my immediate left and working out, we have Tommy Newman is the Vice President of Public Affairs and Activation for the United Way of Greater Los Angeles, which has been fighting homelessness at the system level in LA County since 2010. We have Lance Christensen, who is Vice President of Education Policy and Government Affairs for the fiscal watchdog group, the California Policy Center. We have Selena Alvarez, is the Executive Director of Housing Works, which provides housing and accompanying services for hundreds of formerly unhoused people in LA County. Next to her, we have Sean Morrissey, who is a Vice President of Advocacy and Community Engagement for Union Station Homeless Services. And as someone who himself has struggled with homelessness and substance use disorder, he also heads their Lived Expertise Advisory Panel. And then on the far end, we have Shri Todorov, Executive Director of the Los Angeles County Homelessness Initiative, which is the main coordinating body behind the county's efforts to fight homelessness, and she's here to provide crucial context on the county's existing funding streams. So just some background to get us started. In 2017, LA County voters passed Measure H, a quarter-cent sales tax that provided the county's first ongoing revenue stream to fight homelessness. It's set to expire in 2027. If passed this November, Measure A would repeal that prior tax early and replace it with a larger half-cent sales tax, which would fund some additional things, including the creation of new affordable housing. If it passes, it's expected to raise more than $1 billion a year in a county where more than 75,000 people have nowhere to call home. So to kick things off, Cherie, I wanted to hear from you. It's been 7 years since voters approved the original 2017 sales tax. What has the county used that funding to accomplish to date?
Yes, and thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I am here representing the County of Los Angeles, and as you referred to, the work that we've done over the last number of years with Measure H funding. And so as a result of that, I do have some numbers, so I'm going to be occasionally referring to those because I am a little data heavy on mine. So since its inception in 2017, Measure H has helped permanently house over 44,000 people and has placed 83,000 people in interim housing and shelter. Measure H has also provided homeless prevention help to over 10,000 people. Measure H as well is a vital source of funding for encampment resolution efforts countywide, and so that includes the county's encampment resolution program, which is known as Pathway Home. That program to date has brought over 800 people inside and has also removed over 500 dilapidated RVs from the streets. And Measure H funding is also using to partner with and support the City of Los Angeles' encampment resolution program, which is known as Inside Safe.
Thank you. Sorry, go ahead.
I'll hand it back.
Thank you. And Selena, I wanted to hear from you specifically about how it's impacted your organization at Housing Works. I know permanent supportive housing is a really important component of what you do. And that is basically permanent housing for folks who are formerly homeless who need a little bit of extra support. So it comes with services like case management and linkages to things like counseling, mental health services, physical health services, addiction treatment, that kind of thing. Tell me a little bit about how the way you were able to fund and provide those services changed when Measure H passed.
Absolutely. So this year is my 31st year working in nonprofit services. So in Los Angeles, I call myself a nonprofit lifer. And so I've been around long enough to know, to see the evolution of the system, of the homeless response system. And I come from a time where permanent supportive housing services, funding in permanent supportive housing didn't exist. You just served a building if you were partnering with a developer, but there was absolutely zero funds attached to that. And so what it means is that we were doing a lot of free work, right? And we were doing it because it had to be done. When Measure H rolled out, one of the immediate benefits that we instantly saw was that the buildings and the services that we were looking to provide to people but didn't have the resources to do so, suddenly we had the doors flung open and we had opportunity to staff up, ramp up, and roll out the service provision in a way that we knew was going to be cutting edge and necessary in order to provide a quality of life for the people we serve.
Excellent, thank you. And Lance, I wanted to bring your perspective in. You know, this measure doesn't really have a lot of organized opposition, but there are, you know, some folks are critical of it, and I know you have some criticisms. You know, clearly something needs to be done about the homelessness crisis on our street, but why do you believe that raising taxes is not the answer here?
Well, first of all, I want to thank CalMatters for having me here. You guys do great events. We have watched from a statewide level about the lack of real good oversight on homelessness funds across the state. You have Prop 63 funding, which has been going on for years. I worked in the legislature for 17 years and worked a lot on trying to deal with any number of the mental health issues. So I think there's some really systemic policies that we need to address at the state level to allow for the locals to better serve their community. But by throwing more money at it when we haven't really, at least from our perspective, we have not seen a very productive use of the previous funds, it seems to me a little bit premature, especially when it doesn't run out until 2027, that maybe the city, county, state should really step back and say, okay, we've not been as honest and upfront with the public as we should be. We need to have a real conversation about what's the totality of policies we can adopt, especially now that Grants Pass has gone through the Supreme Court. What's the totality of policies we can deal with? And that's not just the mental health stuff. It's not just if Prop 36 passes, how does that impact it? What's going to happen when we are not really reforming some of our CEQA environmental laws that prohibit a lot of building and expansion of other things or increase the cost? We have conversations too about the cost of labor in the state of California. Just throwing another half-cent sales tax to me doesn't seem to be a solution. It just seems to me to be kicking the can down the road.
Mm-hmm. And to respond to that, Cherie, but what will happen from the county's perspective if we don't put more money at this? You know, if we allow Measure H, the original sales tax, to expire in 2027, and if nothing comes along to replace it, what will happen to the county's funding for homeless services?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So right now, Measure H funding is going into every community in the County of Los Angeles. As Selena alluded to, a lot of those dollars are going directly to nonprofit community-based service providers that are serving all 88 cities and all of our unincorporated areas. We do a lot of the funding directly to service providers because they are the ones touching the clients, engaging them and bringing them inside. We also, however, fund directly the 4 continuums of care in the County of Los Angeles. We fund the councils of government, which are collections of cities, and we also fund cities directly. We have done some analysis about what would happen if Measure H does expire. And we have 2 scenarios that we have looked at. One of them would be that if all of the Measure H funded interim housing and housing subsidies lost their funding today, so if we were no longer had shelters funded with Measure H and we no longer had rental subsidies funded with Measure H, unsheltered homelessness would increase about 28% based on the 2024 loss of point-in-time count. So what this is, it's based on the number of Measure H funded interim housing beds and housing subsidies, which support over 14,500 individuals and families today. If with the loss of these beds and these subsidies, because it's actually a bed that somebody's sleeping in tonight, or it's a rental subsidy that is paying for somebody's rent, with the loss of those, we would expect that these individuals would quickly become homeless. We did a second analysis looking at trend and demographic data, and we project that within the year of its expiration in 2027, more than 57,000 people will be actively supported in their interim or permanent housing with subsidies and supported services funded by Measure H. So those 50,000 people would all immediately face housing instability and are at risk of becoming homeless.
Thank you. And Tommy, you were saying that it could be even worse than that, right? If with some of the additional services that could be lost.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for organizing this today, and it's great to be together with all of you. I think we are at a dramatic fork in the road in the arc of LA County's history. Do we want to go backwards or do we want to go forwards? Do we want to sustain the incremental progress that we've made? I think people very quickly forget that 2017 was the first time we ever decided locally to put our tax dollars into this with intention. LA County existed for a long time before 2017. And so this is a challenge that is generations in the making, and I think it's quite remarkable the work that's happened over the last 7 years, but we've also learned a lot over the last 7 years, right? And what we've learned, one of the things that we've learned, is that unless we can do a better job of tackling inflow of people falling into homelessness, we're gonna keep struggling. And in fact, if we had figured out how to tackle inflow over the last few years, we've built the largest rehousing system, the largest coordinated effort to get people from homelessness back into housing of any county in the United States of America. 27,000 people moved back into permanent housing last year. That is remarkable. But what we haven't wrapped our arms around is how do we prevent folks from falling into homelessness. Measure A actually has 5 clear goals in it, and one of those 5 goals is reduce the number of people falling into homelessness. We have never set a county-wide prevention goal before. That's a big deal. So there's a lot at stake. There is a lot at stake when it comes to lives. There's a lot at stake when it comes to progress or lack thereof. Measure A is not a campaign that's telling everybody, we've done great, we've figured it all out, everything's great. Measure A is really a campaign about acknowledging what we've learned, what has worked and what hasn't, trying to offer some context. It's hard. Folks are frustrated out there, to be sure. Folks are frustrated. But we know that we are the ones we've been waiting for, and we've got to step up to continue marching forward.
Yeah. And that is a big difference with the new proposed tax, with Measure A, as opposed to the prior tax, is that it would set aside some money for the creation of new affordable housing and services designed to prevent additional people from falling into homelessness, which the current tax does not. So that would be a big difference. And speaking of ways that we could actually use this money in a productive way, Sean, I wanted to get your perspective on, some of the best ways to actually allocate this money. You told me that when you were homeless in LA County and struggling with substance use, a big part of what kept you from getting back on your feet was, a lack of an ability to access effective treatment. How would you like to see Measure A dollars spent in a way that would make it so other people don't have to struggle with that?
Yeah, I think I really wanted to maybe piggyback on what Tommy was just saying, and just say that I understand why from the community perspective it looks like nothing is happening or nothing has happened. And from an on-the-ground service provider perspective, we look at the work that's happening as something that has never happened in the history of modern-day homelessness before, in terms of the numbers of people who are alive today because of that funding, who are in housing, who are thriving. We're talking about over 100,000 people in the past 5 years, and that I think it is important to repeat that. That 27,000 who were permanently housed, an equal number fell newly into homelessness. And those aren't people who are just making, rotten decisions. Those are people who are being priced out of their units. So when we think about Measure H and Measure A from a service provider perspective, what we see happening is something we've never seen before, and these are prodigious results, and it's really amazing how many people have been helped. So for us, it's a no-brainer because we're seeing it from that perspective. As far as treatment, yes, I am a former substance user, and one of the things that I struggled with coming out of homelessness for the last year of homelessness was just trying to jump through the hoops to get into a treatment program. And I was unable to do that, and finally landed at the shelter where I now work, who provided me with a navigator and love and nurture and unconditional positive regard, all those things that actually heal people. Housing alone, treatment alone, none of those things actually fix people or heal people, but community and love. And the models that we work under now, which are these highly relational models of housing first, harm reduction, trauma-informed care, that's what Measure A, what Measure H has funded, and what Measure A will continue to fund. Those models have only been around for a short period of time, the past 10, 15 years or so, and that also equally is why we're seeing the results that we're seeing, because people are not seen as the sum of their pathology. They're seen as full human beings who deserve all the same things that we all deserve. We tried to help someone get into treatment last week, and couldn't get into detox unless they had what was called a safe haven plan coming out of detox. Couldn't get into detox unless they were on their medications for 2 weeks ahead of time, and couldn't get into detox unless there was a treatment plan coming out on the back end. And that's in 2024. That's what our systems look like. And I think that what Measure A promises, especially in terms of some of the oversight that Tommy described, is a level of oversight and a level of system change that has to happen within those treatment systems, because those treatment systems just don't help people who are on the street and need to get better. They help people who are at risk of becoming homeless and catching that problem and treating it effectively before homelessness happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And tied to that, one of the goals of Measure A is to actually reduce the number of people with serious mental illness or substance use disorder living on the streets. That's a huge goal. It's one that LA County and everywhere else in California really struggles with. Tommy, what are your thoughts on how Measure A can accomplish that, and what are the best ways to use that money in order to actually make a dent in that massive problem?
Yeah, when we talk about accountability, which I think all of us agree is critical, knowing whether or not we are making progress, understanding what the obstacles are to making progress, I'd say this is one of the most ambitious goals of the 5 in this measure. And I think one of the things that many of us, this is a citizens initiative, was written in consultation and collaboration with a whole lot of folks across this county, and done in a way that we haven't done one of these before. This is the first countywide citizens initiative revenue measure in the history of Los Angeles County, and that's a big deal. And when we were working on this particular goal, the vision behind it, and in conversations with mental health workers, with the business community, with everybody and their mother, was how do we have a goal here with dollars tied to it that helps coordinate some of those other dollars, whether it's the Prop 1 dollars or other state funds or federal funds. How do we sort of create a North Star that we can all collectively drive towards and weave together? It's not going to just be the Measure A funds that are the sole source of dollars that transform how we support folks with serious mental illness who are living on our streets and help them come indoors. It's going to be a lot of things, and care accords is a piece of that, and we have to figure out how that fits in, and the conservatorship components that the state has reformed, that's a big piece of it. All of these things fit together. It's also one of the big learnings that we have from the Measure H time period, which is supportive housing. Permanent housing with on-site services is really effective for some folks, but not for everybody. And there are other solutions that need to be out there. And so we see Measure A as creating North Star, 5 clear North Stars that we can all track and understand. And then it will be on some of these new oversight bodies that the Board of Supervisors has created that bring together experts from all walks of life to set those goals. They're working on setting the metrics for those goals right now, and they plan to release a draft later this month, I'm told. The measure requires the goals to be set and approved by the Board of Supervisors by April 1st, 2025. So we will have clear North Star with numbers attached to them, and then it'll be the hard work of tracking that progress, figuring out what's working, figuring out what's not, and continuing to refine and adjust. So this is a challenge that is decades in the making, and Measure A sort of helps us lift all boats to tackle it with the resources we need.
Yeah, and speaking of that oversight, those 2 oversight bodies that you mentioned, one is the executive committee that's, county and city leaders, and one is the leadership table, and that's, people from the business community, the faith community, service providers, city staff, a bunch of people. And this is coming at a time when there's been a lot of talk about accountability of homelessness spending. There's been audits saying the state is not tracking how it's spending its homelessness funding, so there's a lot of conversation about this. Lance, what are your thoughts on these new oversight bodies? Do you think that this will help with accountability for this spending?
I think oversight isn't easy to say. It's hard to do. And part of the problem is most of the people in LA County just don't believe there's any oversight at all right now. And there's nothing stopping the Board of Supervisors or the conglomeration of interested parties from doing that now. If I were doing this and wanting to get more than scraping past the 50% threshold, I would say to the community, okay, we're going to come back in 2026. We're going to have a really strong set of oversight metrics now. We're not going to wait till later. We're going to show you how we can use this limited half-cent or quarter-cent sales tax effectively before we come back and eliminate the sunset and double that tax. Just enough people in the county look around. I deal with local elected officials in LA all the time, and it's a lot of passing the buck. All of the goals here, totally sympathetic with, 100%. We've got to get people off the street, and there's a lot of ways we can do that. Doubling the tax indefinitely, promising future oversight, to me, just isn't going to cut the cake.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of oversight, Sean, I'm curious what you think. Part of the leadership table, it includes 3 people who have experience being homeless. You lead the Lived Expertise Advisory Panel at your organization. Why is it so important to have people with lived experience of homelessness at the table when we make these policy decisions? And then how do you do that right? How do you make sure that you are listening to their voices rather than just having them there as like a token presence?
Yeah, I'm just realizing that I'm the lived experience person on this panel. It's crucial First of all, you have to, I mean, there's this saying that nothing about us without us. If you're not including people who have lived through these issues, then what are you doing? And I would ask what we're doing in separate of measure A or measure H. I think that the promise of lived expertise inclusion has been that people with lived experience will be at the table and be involved in all facets of program development and leadership, and that just hasn't happened within the homeless service sector. We have tasked people with showing up and telling their trauma stories. We kind of introduce them as their pathology. That always gets thrown in, but we have not really included people in meaningful ways. So, and we struggle with that at my own agency too, just because I think this is so ingrained. It's really hard for us to see people who have struggled with some of the issues that we have struggled with. And if you saw me, 22 years ago, you would have walked across to the other side of the street. But what was inside was different than my outside presentation. We've just asked people to show up and tell trauma stories, and that has to change, and it is changing slowly. There's a movement to make sure that doesn't happen. So at Union Station, we do have. I'm on the executive team there. We do have people with lived expertise on our board and working within the agency. And I probably am forgetting the second part of your question, but the idea of like having a real voice and making it meaningful and having people pay attention to this. And then the other thing with lived experience is, with all of the gifts that I may bring, my trauma also has its own gifts, if you will, that come along with that. So being able to look at that and see that and make room for that within an agency or within the, in the space.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's so important to keep in mind because I think, lived experience is becoming more and more prevalent in these conversations. We have more advisory boards, but it's always great to just hear about how to actually really make use of this valuable expertise rather than just saying that you do. So I think that's so important.
Yeah, and we've done that. We've created avenues so that happens at our agency. Yeah.
Absolutely. Selena, I wanted to go back to you. Obviously, you're in strong support of Measure A, but I know you also don't think that this is a silver bullet that'll fix everything. This is such a huge issue. What are some concerns that you have about potential things that could fall through the cracks or holes in Measure A that even if it passes are things you still worry about?
Well, one of the main things that I worry about is that, and it's been clear through the messaging and through what we're hoping to accomplish, and I'm just going to say once Measure A passes, there's still a lot of work to be done. And there's going to continue being gaps in service provision. We need this funding to come through so that we can hold larger systems accountable for what they need to do. It's time for us to get out of mirroring what we know when in the nonprofit sector as the nonprofit industrial complex. We're functioning behind the 8 ball. We're functioning in such a way where we're all pushing forward. We're very dedicated to move efforts forward, and yet we're still seeing that ledge over there with the cliff where we could all potentially fall over if we're not careful and make decisions that are in the best interest of the community. So my concern is if it doesn't pass, we're going to end up seeing, if we think we have a problem now, just wait for the tsunami that awaits us, right? And when it passes, we still have to roll up our sleeves and really get honest about the areas that we have to really hone in on and understand that there's systemic issues that are racist, historically, that need to be overhauled. And so we have to come together as part of this effort and really move the needle forward in such a way where we can bring folks forward and have honest conversations about the gaps in service provision. Otherwise, we're going to see a deeper dilution of service provision take place, and we're going to see a halt in affordable housing take place. We're going to see systems being more largely impacted than we see it today, and yet, we have got to all rally forward and do this collectively, and be determined to do it in the most honest way from a systems level, and really be interested in understanding together what is it that we as a collective force in the homeless service response system, what do we need to improve the lives of the people that we're all looking to serve. I know that there's areas of Measure A that we know are going to impact in a positive way, the way that we're able to provide the services and the resources that the community needs. And if we're not careful with these conversations, it can also be harmful.
Thank you for that. And Lance, I wanted to hear from you. What do you think is a better alternative to passing this tax and putting more funding into into what we've done so far, into the systems that we have so far? What would you rather see, and what changes would you rather see to the system?
Well, again, I think all of the panelists up here really want, in the end, not to have any homeless people. I think that's the ultimate goal for all of us. The question comes back to, when we talk about the systemic problems, nobody has really figured out how to overcome that. So throwing more money at the problem doesn't fix that problem. In fact, I have seen it, again, in my 25-ish years in California policy and politics, I've seen when we throw more money at it, it actually gets worse. And so we've got to step back and take a deep breath. And if the senior leadership in LA County, city, at the state level want to stop and say, let's hold a special session where we just focus on this one issue, because it's not just in LA. I'm up near Sacramento, the Bay Area. This is pretty much an entire California problem. Worse here for a lot of different reasons. But we should have a really serious conversation about how all these different pieces are going to come together. The gravely disabled issues, the codependency and comorbidities of alcoholism and drug use. Basically, we have a public school to prison pipeline right now, and so these kids don't get any. Our education system is absolutely 100% broke in California, and so a lot of these kids just go basically from the playground to the prison yard, and then when they get out, that mental health system wasn't very good in the prison, and so they're back on the streets, and they're just in and out of the court system. We need to talk about housing and development in terms of what the environmental issues look like: inclusionary housing, impact fees, development out. California's huge. I travel the state all the time. There's a plenty of area for us to expand that doesn't require us throwing all of our resources into urban areas. And there are models throughout the nation I think we should look at. San Antonio's Haven for Hope, I think, is probably the best model out there. There's no reason you couldn't replicate something very similar to that in California throughout these cities. But we need, if we're going to talk about throwing billions of dollars more to this, we've got to be honest with the citizens. And frankly, most people have no idea that this would double the tax and then cut off the sunset. I think for the proponents of that, that's a little disingenuous for most people, because they think they're just eliminating this old program that didn't work. They're not hearing that we're going to double your tax and it's going to be, infinite. I think there should be a real sunset. 5 years. You got 5 years to figure it out. If you can't do it in 5 years, then let's, again, go back to the drawing board. So there's no need to pass it now. 2026, you still have time. But there should be a real plan that does consider these system-wide issues more seriously.
Yeah. Tell me, what is your response to that? obviously you guys deal with poverty all over the county, and people really are struggling with inflation, with the cost of goods, and increasing the sales tax. It might be a burden for folks, and LA County does already have some of the highest tax rates in the county in some cities. What is your response to that in terms of, is this going to be a burden on folks that might, for some people make things worse in that regard?
Yeah, 2 points. First, context is really important. The city of New York spends $1.2 billion a year of locally generated funds to address homelessness exclusively. We in LA County spend half that much. So if you want to know why there aren't 75,000 people, 50 to 60,000 people on the streets of New York, it's because they chose to invest in solutions. Now, unfortunately, it's a whole lot of folks living in shelter because they haven't figured out how to get the housing component figured out there. And so they have one of the largest sheltered homeless populations of anywhere in the world. But this requires investment. I think it's really important that we're sitting in this space today thinking about infrastructure, and we have all of these great examples of infrastructure. Housing is infrastructure, and we don't question whether or not we should keep building housing. We don't question whether or not we should keep building sewer systems or parks or roads. It's not something that we say, all right, you get 5 years to figure out how to operate the roads in LA County, and then that's it. We keep investing in infrastructure. And so it's a critical component of the competitiveness of LA County, having enough places that people can afford. We see LA County's population stalling out on growth because we haven't figured out how to build enough housing. In fact, the dollars from Measure A and anything that it finances would be exempt from the California Environmental Quality Act, which we think is a big deal and will help prevent some of the NIMBY opposition that is sometimes used to prevent the creation of affordable housing and make it easier to get housing built. We think that's critically important. So I think context is critically important. We can't say, we've been doing this for 7 years and it hasn't been solved. The night that Measure A was passed, I stood next to a woman who has now passed away. Her name was Ruth Schwartz, and she had tears streaming down her face, and she said that she had been working for 30 years to get to that moment, that night. 30 years of saying, we need to invest locally. 30 years of saying, we need more housing and services. We can't do this with, bubble gum and toothpicks. We can't have this sort of narrow, instant gratification approach to this. We also can't say, all the money and whatever it all, we'll see how it plays out. No, we have to be strategic, we have to be smart, we have to have clear goals, we have to hold each other accountable.